Good afternoon. Welcome to all of you here in the Michelle Loris Forum and to all of our streaming viewers online, to the Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series and the Human Journey Colloquia Series. We're proud to present today Dr. Michael Higgins. Dr. Michael Higgins is the inaugural Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. He is also Distinguished Professor of Catholic Thought Emeritus here at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, Senior Fellow of Massey College. He's authored numerous academic studies biographies, many award-winning, and several translated into French and Italian, as well as German and Norwegian. He's also a regular contributor to the Tablet, Commonweal, the Globe and Mail, as well as our own Go Rebuild My House blog here at Sacred Heart. He's an award-winning CBC documentarian, has a doctorate in English, and is an affiliate professor in the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio. He's a past president of 3 Canadian Catholic universities, has been awarded 2 honorary doctorates. So we're proud to welcome Dr. Higgins, who will reflect to us today on his experience covering the Synod of Bishops. Or not the Synod of Bishops, the Synod on the synodality.
Thanks, Dad. Hello, everyone. Glad that you're here, and I'm going to talk a lot, although I have a restricted time, I think, right? An hour and a half, right? Okay, that's right. What I'm going to do is talk about something called the Synod. And I'm going to explain what that is and why the recent synod really mattered more than any other synod we have had since the Second Vatican Council of 1962. So what is a synod? Somebody said to you on the street or in a bar or, on some kind of social media communication, what a synod is, well, first of all, you have to wonder about their sense of reality. But outside that, you'd say, what is a synod? Synod comes from the Greek, synodos, and it means walking together. Okay, it means walking together. That's a very important way of thinking of the synod, because that's exactly what the recent Roman synod was, walking together. There are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. There were 364 people at the synod, plus one. Pope Francis said he wanted to make it a full year, so he was number 365. Okay? That's the people in the synod. But they represent the rest of us on the planet. Now, as you can appreciate, there are lots of complications with that. How do you communicate this? How do you know what the rest of the people think? How do you, in an important way, impart new thinking to them and inspire them? So I want to tell you why the synod is important and why this synod was especially important. Then I'm going to talk personally about my role, which was quite marginal. I was not a synod delegate. I wasn't a representative of the bishops of the United States or Canada or anywhere else. I was there as a journalist, as a writer, as an academic. And so you have to get credentials, and the credentials are for La Sala Stampa della Santa Sede, which is the press office of the Holy See. Now, before I go any further, a lot of you have heard the term Vatican, and you think of the Vatican as the place where the Pope hangs out. That's what the Vatican is. But the Vatican is a territorial entity. It's a state. It's a city-state. And it has an area, a very circumscribed area, just off the Via della Conciliazione in Rome, but it also has what are called extraterritorial entities in the Trastevere, where Sacred Heart has a relationship with John Cabot University. So there are areas throughout Rome that are also part of the Vatican city-state, but they're not geographically centered in the same area. Now, I tell you this because when the bishops and others are summoned to Rome, they come to the heart of the church on the Tiber, okay? It was the heart of empire, it was the heart of the Roman Empire, and now it's the heart of the largest church in Christianity. And that matters. It matters numerically, it matters historically, it matters in terms of the future. So the synod is not held in London or in Chartres or in Constantinople or in Detroit. It's held in Rome. And there are reasons for that, because that's the center of the church, of the Roman Catholic Church. The church has had many synods throughout its history. And the synods are usually called when there's a crisis. Okay? What are we going to do about this? What happened with this? Who's challenging this doctrine? Why is discipline falling apart? What's going on, right? So the synods come together to address issues, right? And they're periodic. From 1969 on, however, they became part of the church's way of governance. Every 3 to 4 years, there'd be a synod in Rome. And the synods were crushingly boring. I covered several of the synods, and the documents were finished before the bishops even arrived at the synod. And they talked about that at this synod, that they would fly in and they would suddenly discover, guess what? We've already written the final document, but we haven't said anything. That doesn't matter. The document is done. Pope Francis flipped that around completely. So when the bishops came this time, they didn't have a document in front of them. They had to create their own momentum. This is big news, folks, because, you know, the people who go to the synod and the people who cover the synod, we're kind of a rarefied breed. The vast majority of Catholics, the synod doesn't touch their life. And in an important way, that's understandable, okay? But this synod was designed to touch the lives of hundreds of millions of Roman Catholics, and not just Roman Catholics, because it was doing something different. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about my rather minimal role on the periphery covering the synod itself. The synod, when it was called by the popes convoke synods, by the way, that's a papal prerogative. He changed the synod to be called a synod on synodality. And he did that because he wanted all the delegates to think about what it's like to be church in a different way. That's pretty revolutionary stuff, okay? What is it like to be a church in a different way? So synodality is a process. It's a process of thinking about the church, about relationship. It's a process of understanding authority and accountability. It's a process that deals with what we sometimes call the neuralgic issues in the church. Same-sex marriage, for instance, or the remarriage of divorced people. All kinds of different issues. How do Catholic people really feel about that? We know what the law says, we know what the official teaching says, but how do the people actually feel about it? So Pope Francis was determined to do a really serious check on the ground. How do people feel about this? Now, he'd had lots of experience. When he was Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, as he was then known, was the major architect of a document that came out of Brazil called the Aparecida document. And he was used to what are called conversations in the spirit. People come, they talk, they engage, but they also pray, and they're also silent. And he loved that model. He loved that model. And so when he's in Rome, he says, well, we're going to have to do the synodal thing in a different way, because the way we're doing it now is not particularly attractive. You would go in, and the bishops would be tiered, like sitting in a plateaued theater, right? And they would sit in their chairs, and then they would pop up for their 3-minute intervention. It was called an intervenzione. They pop up, they read it, they sit down, the next guy pops up, he reads it, he sits down. No interaction, nobody talks. The Pope sitting up the front, sometimes he's awake, sometimes he's not. There used to be jokes about the Pope, particularly John Paul II, reading his breviary while everybody else is getting up to talk. And one year, they let what are called the auditores, those who can go in to listen, come in. Well, I was one of the ones chosen to go in, and there he is up at the front, John Paul reading his breviary. People are talking. Nobody's interacting. Nobody's listening. Okay, so Francis says, well, this is a hell of a way to operate. The synod should be a listening ground. How are we going to make decisions if nobody's listening? So when he created this new synodal model, what he did was, first of all, he took them out of the synod hall, he took them out of the Synod Hall, which was behind the Vatican, to the aula, Paulo VI aula, which is the great hall in which the Pope receives all kinds of people, thousands of people, right? He took that and he told them, just set up tables, round tables, 10 people per table, and then one a secretary, and then one a kind of a facilitator, appointed by the Secretariat for the Synod. So each table would have 12 people, and I'll sit at one of the tables. There'll be no primary table. There's not going to be one table, the papal table, so everybody looks at the Pope. No, I'll sit at a table like everybody else, and we'll set up these tables. Well, the bishops come, because at this point only bishops go. They come and they think, what the heck is this? We're sitting around, it's not only that, we have to sit around with lay people. God help us. So the Pope says, I don't want just bishops talking about this. So he has something like 74 lay people come from around the world. Okay, so they're all sitting there. And there was one student from the University of Wyoming who was there, who represented the student body of the United States. I mean, God knows, the poor kid thinking to himself, what have I just walked into? But anyway, so there was one student, and then you have all these laymen and lay women, many of them highly accomplished professionals, but some of them just ordinary folk, because that's how he operates, Pope Francis, on what is called the theology of the people. He was never a real keen fan of liberation theology, because his argument was that the preferential option for the poor is wrong. It should be a preferential option with the poor. And we must listen to the theology of the people. So he developed his own theological paradigm when he was in Argentina. So now he's in Rome. He's in charge of the Universal Church. He says, I got to find a different model. So he brings everybody together. Then he says, okay, because he's a Jesuit, he knows something, he knows a lot about Ignatian spirituality. So he says, well, we have to move in a process of discernment. But before we do that, we have to be silent. We have to pray, and we have to reverence each other. Now, that's an important term. Just think of that. Just think of it in the context of current political life, not just in the United States, but all over the world. Polarized, ideologically at each other's throats. Nobody reverencing their interlocutor, but despising them. In other words, a context of adversariality. So Francis says, well, we got to move beyond this because this isn't good. We have to reverence the other, irrespective of their point of view, just as the other. So he sets up a context. You got to remember, they have no idea of this. They've never done this before in their lives. The bishops are actually listening to people. They're even listening to each other. Because in the past, they didn't. Each operated as a separate entity given his report. Now, they have to listen. So the Pope starts off, you start off in prayer, and then you go around the table, you introduce yourself. That's all. Silence. More prayer. Then a second round, you go around, say something a little more about who you are and why you think you are there. Silence. A little more prayer. Then you go around the third time, and this time you begin to develop a little more clearly what matters to you as a person. Maybe you're representing, I don't know, Cincinnati or something like that, but or maybe you're representing a region, or maybe you're just there because the bishops or other people thought you would be a good and articulate person. It doesn't matter, but you're going to be heard. That's the thing with Francis. You will be heard. Now, there were people who got ticked off with this. Not many, but a few. Some of them you would know. Cardinal Wallet, who was Marc Wallet, who was previously the guy in charge of the appointment of bishops. The technical term, it was prefect of the dicastery of bishops. He lost his job, and it was given to an American, so he wasn't too happy about that. Secondly, he got up and said, this isn't a synod, because it's not only about bishops. And he got up and he walked off. A cardinal, Schönborn, from Vienna, goes to the floor at the press briefing and says, well, they don't contradict each other directly, but they do it obliquely. He said, I've been at lots of synods. I was a priest at one. There were several who weren't bishops. This has always been the history of the church. The argument that a synod of bishops is composed only of bishops is historically wrong. Now, think of this. A cardinal correcting another cardinal, okay, who walked out in a huff, another cardinal who comes in and defends the position of the church. This would never have happened before. Or if it did, it happened behind closed doors. And people inebriated with incense so they wouldn't know what was going on. Okay? So now they're doing it in public. They're breathing the oxygen of controversy because Francis has told them that the church will move forward in dialogue and engagement. He tells them, using the old Greek phrase parousia, speak with the freedom of the Spirit. These are guys that never did that, and now they're told to do it. And they have to learn how to do it. And lay people will help them do it. So they're sitting around the tables. They're having all these conversations. They're exhausted. They have several sessions during the course of the day. They have the Italian, after pranzo, after their big lunch, they have a little rest and whatnot. But then they come back at 4 o'clock, and they go right to the 7 o'clock or 7:30. And then they go out, and they have cena or whatever. And then they're back first thing in the morning. They have their colazione as they come into the aula. Somebody, well, here's your bun and here's your coffee. We got to get to work here. Nobody's ever worked this hard. They're exhausted. After 6 days in the week, they can barely move, right? And who's at the table with them? Francis, the Pope. So the Pope's coming around. He sits there. He follows the same processes in place for the others. And he makes only 3 interventions during the course of the 4 weeks of the Synod. 3 interventions. And of those interventions, 2 of them were an attack on clericalism. And one of them, particularly on priests who were seminarians who were spending time just outside the aula, on the Borgo, just outside, checking out the latest lace and the latest colors of their cassock and he went after them. He says, "This is not the church. Measuring yourself out for a fancy alb, as they're doing right now." And he said this. So the bishops are there, especially the bishop from, the vicar of Rome, who would be some delegated bishop thinking to himself, "Oh my God, this must be me he's talking about here." So and Francis never lets up. Like, he doesn't say, okay, well, I think maybe having all these young clerics out there, they're not priests even, they're walking around with clerical suits on and everything else. I don't think this is good. And he calls the laity the holy, faithful people of God. He never says laity. He says the holy, faithful people of God deserve better. So get them off the streets. That's what he's saying, right? Meanwhile, in the aula, this is going on in the aula, outside the aula, if you've ever been in Rome, you're walking the streets and there's all these stores with fancy ecclesiastical finery and everything else out of a different epoch. Looks like central casting. And they're all gathered around this. Meanwhile, what does Francis do? Here are the kinds of things that sends the message with such power. In the evenings, late in the evenings, every day I'd have to go to the press briefing. The press briefing was at 2:15, but it's Italy. So it might be 2:15, and it might be 3:15, but you know it's going to be long, and it will be in its own way quite enjoyable, but it won't fit within the rigid framework of a Teutonic country or something like that. So you gather, at the end of the evening, I'm heading back. I have to walk to where I'm living on the Via Aurea, the Via Aurelia, in the Casa Generalizia Immacolato Padre Maria. And so I have to go, because the bus system is, irregular, and the Metropolitana, the subway, is dysfunctional. So in order to meet all the deadlines, I have to walk everywhere. So I get a lot of exercise. The problem is it was the hottest summer in Rome in centuries. And so it was challenging. So in the evening, I would be leaving the Vatican, and then I would notice that between the great pillars in the Bernini porticos, which you will see surrounding the Vatican Square, people were setting up tents. They're setting up their tents. It was an encampment. And Vatican officials and other members of maybe the San Egidio community and other communities, they're there with coffee and food for them. And they set up these, nobody disrespects them. They have a special place for the night. In the morning, before the tourists start coming, and pilgrims, they disassemble and they leave. Now, they wouldn't do that unless the Pope had asked his Cardinal Almoner, take care of my poor. Not by, praying and doing a collection. That's fine, but it's insufficient. So right in the heart of Rome, in this great architectural setting, the Pope allows these encampments because they have nowhere to go. And so many immigrants fleeing Africa and elsewhere have shown up in the south of Italy, and now they're moving up from the south into Rome. So rather than say, okay, let's set up a barricade here and push them back, the Pope welcomes them. That's not very popular. Not very popular. But he also makes sure that the space where Peter lives is a space where others can come. Okay, so you can imagine some of the cardinals and bishops coming from more affluent countries wondering, what the heck is this about? But this is what Francis does. So when he goes in the synod and he's sitting, he's actually listening to people. Okay? He's not necessarily agreeing, but he's listening, because the first step in moving forward in any reform is actually to listen to people. Where are they? Remember, Francis very early on, right from the beginning, said realities are more important than ideas. Right from the beginning. Abstractions matter. Doctrine matters. But the mercy of Jesus that is mediated in the church as a field hospital is primary. That's primary. That's never secondary. But you have to live that way. You have to model that. And so Francis attempts in his own life to exercise that kind of ministry. And you can see people surrounding him who believe that, but they're not all on his side. And you could see some of the tensions coming out there, but he never suppressed division. He said, don't talk about that. Oh, no, you can talk about it. Here was the problem I faced. And let me just say a few words about this. When I was commissioned to write this book by Paulus Press in Mahwah, New Jersey, they said, go over there and write this book on site the way John Reed wrote the book called The 10 Days That Shook the World. Now, that was a book published in 1917, okay? So most of you don't likely look like you were around for 1917, all right, other than perhaps Professor Loris and myself. But 1917 was the Russian Revolution, okay? And the Americans sent over this very enterprising writer called John Reed, and he wrote this book called The 10 Days That Shook the World, right? So the Paulus people said, well, you go over and write a book called The 30 Days That Shook the Church. All right, well, that's not a bad idea, except now it's got to be 60 days because Francis decided one synod wasn't good enough, so he's going to divide it into sessions. So what happened last October is going to continue next October, so I had to change the title of the book, and I have to go back now. But the thing about this, about being a journalist, is when you're a journalist and an academic in Rome, you have to go through a process of appropriate vetting, okay? So they review all kinds of things. I think it's really perfunctory. I don't think anybody, I mean, I wrote a book about heretic blood, and they gave me credentials. I don't think they're working at this very closely, right? So I end up, I get my credentials, I have my face on it, which is mildly recognizable as me, and everything else in Italian, of course, and they have to carry this thing, because if you don't carry this badge, you're liable to be jabbed by some halberd or something, a pike by the Swiss Guard, because they take this stuff really seriously. So you wear your badge, and it gives you access to what are called the press briefings. So every day, somebody 4 or 5 would come out, and they'd sit in the dais, and they would say a few words, and it would be mostly kind of spin doctoring of a sort, and then they would open themselves up to questions, and that's when things would change. And that's why you knew that this was a new world coming out of the Synod, because they didn't prevaricate, nor they didn't allude to something else or evade. They actually responded. So how the system worked was the people who are the Synod delegates are gathering together, having these thoughts: authority, pastoral formation, clerical abuse, married priests, the role of women in ministry, the possibility of ordination to the diaconate, all these issues, gay sex, and for the Africans, the big thing is polygamy. Okay, so when the Western church gets annoyed with the African church and says, well, why weren't you more positive about LGBTQ issues? They say, well, because for us, the priority is polygamy. And how do you work that within the context of Christian marriage? But it's also coming out of a very different anthropology. So there's a very strong discomfort level with non-generative or non-procreative sex. Okay, so it's a cultural anthropological issue, and so when the bishops are there, they talk frankly now. People sitting at the table say, "Oh, well, okay, so that's a little different than what we thought it was." And some of you would know Jim Martin, who's the Jesuit priest who has been here at Sacred Heart many times. Jim was there; he's appointed by the Pope to be there. One patriarch from the Eastern Church came to the table. Martin himself told me this when we were having lunch. He came to the table, he said, "Oh, it's you." And he picked up his water bottle, and he says, "I'm not sitting with you." And he got up and he left and went elsewhere. Because Martin represented to him Western decadence. Okay, so I'm not going to have anything to do with this. So I said to Martin, how did you respond? He said, well, it was disturbing. He took my water bottle. And I said, so you didn't go back to reclaim it? He said, no, he didn't look like a happy camper. So he said he's one of these guys that the Pope is trying to get people to relate to each other beyond their honorifics. So, and beyond their titles. So when people would say, when they introduce themselves and refer to the Pope, Sanctissime Padre, Your Holiness, right? Holy Father, right? And he said, oh, yeah, but I'm Father, Father Francis and whatnot. So some of the patriarchs have an exalted, exaggerated love for titles. One of them was referred to as Your Beatitude, which is the technically correct way of referring to a patriarch, but he had been recently created a cardinal. So he corrected the person speaking and said, well, I'm Your Eminence Beatitude. What the heck does this have to do with Jesus? Can you imagine any scene in the Gospels where Jesus is saying that is an inappropriate way to address me and the disciples? I mean, it's just mind-numbing. Right? So there are the crazy things that happen as well within the context of the Synod. Francis never, again, stands in judgment on them. I want to give you a wonderful example. So the issue of gay marriage comes up, okay? And it's an issue mostly driven, if you like, by North Americans. It's some Europeans, but mostly North Americans. So the Pope doesn't, he does what he said he's going to do, and he's listening, and everybody else is listening. Nobody's getting up, grandstanding, making a great statement or something. They're talking. What does it mean? What happens if you're gay? Or you have friends who are gay? Or friends who want to be married in the church but cannot be? What are the possibilities and whatnot? So some of the press that were there, the right-wing press, the press was large. There were hundreds of us, from both the secular and the religious media. The Catholic media surprisingly had a number who were really quite young, very impressive. But a great deal of the very young ones were also ultra-conservative. They were looking for a model of church and a religious identity they couldn't find. And so they would query the bishops coming every day. Bang, bang, bang. Is this really a synod? Does it have authority? What are you doing about divine revelation? What is the nature of biblical anthropology? Every day, going after this is coming from the right-wing press, because the left-wing press is fairly pro-Francis, so it's not calling people to task over these. It's trying to better understand, right? So there's the internal dynamic that's going on there. There was one woman, Diana Montagna, an Italian from Pennsylvania, and she had studied extensively in Europe. She'd be only in her early 30s, writes for the Catholic Herald of London, writes for some German, French, and Italian papers. Very sharp, very sharp. A polyglot, speaks several languages, studied theology. Studied theology in the context of the 19th century. So her theology was 19th century theology. And the Pope's is kind of 21st, going on 22nd theology. So you can see that there's tension here. So one time she would get up and she'd ask these questions all the time to a bishop. She said, well, you're an African bishop. You must have difficulty with homosexual relations and whatnot. And the African bishops were very clever. They'd say, well, now, especially the Archbishop of Kinshasa, Capuchin, head of the Episcopal Conference of African Conferences and Madagascar. And he said, well, ask me that question after the second session. Okay, so he bought himself some time. But he was saying, I'm not going down this rabbit hole. I know what you're doing, right? So they would push him on this. So the gay community, and Martin was quite depressed about some of it, were feeling under the gun, even though the church was not going to make any statement at the end of the synod in its synthesis report that would indicate a departure from current practice. Why? Because it's still in gestation. That's how Francis works. He won't move until he has what he considers to be a legitimate consensus, because he won't divide the church. You've got to remember, what is the Petrine ministry? What is a pope? The pope is Peter's successor, and his primary job is unity. If he starts dicking around with the unity, then the church crumbles. All right, so he does not want to go in the direction of the Anglican Church, the Anglican Commonwealth. He wants to move gradually. We'll get there, we'll work it through, but we don't fracture the unity of the church. It's my job. I'm Peter's successor. That's my job. He takes that quite seriously, and that's why criticism of Francis has reckless by people, particularly on the right, and people on the left, are misrepresenting him. He's a steady, moderate, sometimes frustratingly slow figure. During a previous synod, a synod that was called for the Amazon, a majority of the delegates there asked for the ordination of married men, called the viri probati, the mature men. He wouldn't move on it, even though because there was not sufficient consensus. Is that what he wants? Of course it is. But he's not going to divide the church in the process. So he'll build up a deeper understanding. How do you do that? You get people to respect each other, to actually hear each other, not respond instinctively in argument form, but respond in love. I know it sounds platonic and it sounds unreal, but for Francis, it's the only way you move forward in dialogue. One of the reasons why he, through his Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, and his sostituto, who is a man called Paul Gallagher, originally from Liverpool in England, he's been trying to mediate the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, and has offered to do so between Hamas and Tel Aviv. But in every single case, he's been turned down. But a very close rabbi friend of mine said to me, the only person in the world who could intervene and bring any resolution to the crisis in Hamas, in the Holy Land, and with Israel is Pope Francis. And I think in great measure that's true. Because one of the things Francis first does is he listens. He listens with profound attention. Okay? He's not into easy resolution of conflicts because he knows that doesn't happen. But first of all, you have to listen and reverence each other. When it was a couple of years ago, actually, they brought in the special assembly in Rome. They brought in some representatives of the Eastern Church, and the Pope knelt down and he kissed their... No, that's not true. They brought in representatives from Sudan and from Darfur, and the violence that is prevalent there and is as great as it is in any other of the war theaters right now. In fact, perhaps greater in terms of human loss. He knelt down and kissed the feet of the two primary generals who were at war in Darfur. This act of humility and reconciliation profoundly moved the generals. Did it end the war in Darfur? No. But it moved them closer to an understanding of each other as human beings. That's just how Francis works. So when they're gathered, at the end of the day, they send these representatives who go and they sit on the dais and they respond to questions from the floor, as I say. What arose very often during the course of the 4 weeks were all the living controversies everyone in this room knows. I don't have to enumerate them. There would be no surprises, okay? How is the church responding to modernity? How is the church, in fact, responding to postmodernity? Like, where are we? How do you make the gospel message credible, real, in a world that is constantly shifting? Francis, drawing on the work of a great Italian philosopher and theologian by the name of Romano Guardini, talks about the technological paradigm. And you couldn't be more enmeshed in a technological paradigm than we are now, with social media, with competing hegemonic interests by big business, hyper-centralization, the huge discrepancy in social inequity between the dwindling middle class, the impoverished lower class, and an upper, uber billionaire class that continues to amass greater and greater monies. So what do you do with this technological paradigm with all its economic and social ramifications? You have to find a different way of thinking about what it is to be human, what it is to live in solidarity, what it is to be a commonweal, a commonwealth of other humans. And more importantly, when you get to his ecological statements, what it means in a very real way to value all of creation, including all the animals that make up the richness that is our common kingdom. So these are the things that are important to Francis, and they are the things that surfaced during the course of the Synod itself. Let me just say just a couple of remaining remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions. There was one occasion, what I suppose was comic in a way, but it was illustrative of kind of a general dysfunctionality. But there was this young guy who's now doing a doctorate at Berkeley, and he had been a catechist, and he had been trained in theology, and he was very strong spokesperson for the Catholic gay community. And he had been fired by his archbishop through the chancellor, who asked questions about the intimacies of his sex life. And he said, well, I'm Human Rights Commission, human rights law, that does not allow you to make those kind of queries. But the chancellor was dissatisfied and said, well, your life is not in consonance with our teaching. And so, therefore, you're fired. So this is not uncommon. He was in Edmonton, Alberta. There are similar experiences in Indiana and Ohio, and some of them are precedent-setting, actually, where human rights law is just turned on its head, and the rights and privileges of religious jurisdictional law take precedence. Francis wouldn't have done that, because Francis accords mercy and justice primarily to the person. Doesn't mean approval of the behavior. It means to value the person. So this young chap was in Rome as part of a whole group of people, many of them from Fordham University. It was a whole contingent from Fordham University were there, not just in that capacity, but in other capacities as well. And I said I would like to interview him for the book. So I went to one of the people in the Sala Stampa, and I said, could I use one of these rooms that are unused? Like there's nobody there. One of these rooms for my interview with this young man. They said, he said, yeah, I don't see a problem, but I have to check with my superior. Okay, it's Rome. So he goes, and the woman comes back, and she said, yeah, I think that this can work, but I have to check with my superior. So I said, would it be better if I went right to Francis myself? Got an answer here? She said, well, okay, I have to go. So the next guy comes out, and he's a very officious guy, quite pumped up with himself, dressed in the best Milanese finery, and it's going to be very clear who I am and who you are. And, of course, I'm dressed as I am now, which is not distinguished by its finery. So he says, no, you can't do this interview here. You have to do it in the street. I said, do it in the street. Have you ever been on a Roman street? There's absolute noise. The ambience will wipe out the interview. He said, nope, not here, out in the street. I said, look, your job is to facilitate and to allow and enable journalists to do their job. You're putting a hurdle in my way. Do you understand? I understand perfectly, he says, on the street. So I thought, okay. So I went on the street. I interviewed him. I had actually worked out to be quite a good interview, but I never forgot that encounter. And I thought, uh-oh, I probably overstepped my response here by being so assertive. And he could bar me from coming in and say, well, you can't come in the press room anymore because you are a rebel and a dissident. So I thought, oh my God, how am I going to explain this to my publisher? I'm expelled and I'm not even there for 3 days. So this kept me up all night. I thought, what the hell? Maybe if I look different, I put some sunglasses on or something, get a wig or something. Nobody knows it's me, right? So he knows he's watching me moving in the room. But so eventually, I have to, there's a Zoom, and it's a Sacred Heart Zoom. So there were people, it was going to be our special Zoom thing with regard to the Synod. Okay, they were preparing for November, and we're going to have a preliminary setting. So I had to go back, and so I went through the same thing. I have to talk to my superior, and I thought, oh my God, I know where this is going to end up. So sure enough, out comes the thug, and I said, okay, it's me again. He said, what do you want? I said, I need the room. I'll give you the room, and I'll bring you water so you don't get dehydrated. So I said, what the hell happened here? Okay, was it some kind of extraneous experience of conversion because of this? Was this because the previous time was a bad day? Or because he thought, okay, if I keep getting in this guy's way, I'm going to end up in the book and it's not going to look good? I don't know, but he changed. So I went in and we had the Zoom. So you have to be flexible. You have to realize the limitations of your access. Francis did something which was actually problematic because rather than allowing the journalists access to the texts or the interventions, what he did is he turned the first week into the spiritual exercises. So he wanted them to experience synodality spiritually, which was a brilliant idea for those inside. For those outside, it wasn't a good idea because it meant we had nothing to talk about, So my editor in Toronto says, well, what's going on? I said, well, they're having conversations in the spirit. She says, well, what is that, like a bar? I said, no. It's like the Holy Spirit. She said, we can't put that in a secular newspaper, conversations in the spirit. So she said, you have to give me something. I said, well, it's... what about this guy who's going to throw me out of the press office? Is that interesting? No, it's not a comedy piece. So you had to find ways of moving around, navigating, talking to people. And sometimes it was carnivalesque, and sometimes it was pretty solemn, but mostly it was deeply human. That's what Francis wanted, and they loved it. The people who left, there were bishops, I'm telling you this, I've been to several synods. Bishops came out and said, we didn't know what to expect. This has changed how we think. And cardinals and bishops said, we didn't like the idea. Yeah, I was opposed to it. I thought, oh God, this is another one of Francis's ideas. And he said, this has changed me. Okay? Now, I think that's very important. And so it kind of validates Francis's privileging spirituality over the actual content and giving the journalists access. But it did make our job a little more difficult. But so eventually we had to rely on the press briefings, and increasingly they spoke more and more frankly. So by the time of the end of the Synod, we had substantial stuff. So, final comment. Where do we go from here? And really, why does it matter? Why does it matter to a number of people sitting here in the Loris Hall at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, United States of America, in the year 2024. It matters because Francis has made a seismic shift in how we understand the Church from the magisterial model to the synodal model. It will take generations to be perfectly incorporated into the governance life of the Church. Don't think that this is going to happen overnight. But this is the genius of the Bergoglio papacy, to begin things, to allow things, that slow process of maturity, to make it possible that the Roman Catholic Church will again, as it once did, be the major instrument for human freedom, for the deeper witness of the gospel, cut off from all the kinds of dysfunctions and pathologies that have affected the church over the centuries. Now, is this idealistic? Of course. But the Gospels are idealistic. They call us to be greater than ourselves. He's calling the church to be greater than itself. And he knows that his role is a minor role. Just like John the 23rd, what did he do? He convoked the council. When he convoked the council in 1959 to his cardinals sitting there, his curio officials, deadpan, they thought, he's crazy. Okay, and so John the 23rd went back to his room and he said to Loris Capavilla, who was his assistant, he said, "What was that? I tell them we're gonna have this big event. We haven't had anything like this in at least a century." And they sit there. They said, he said, Holy Father, it's going to take a while to seep in. And it did. But it did seep in. And his successor had a few years to work at it. That's what's going to happen with the Synod. My hope is that there'll be greater discussion around several of the items that surfaced. But what is important for me, speaking just for myself here, is that he's turning the church into an engine of revitalization, of spiritual presence where it should be. He's making the church, and I hate to use this phrase, but I think it's appropriate, relevant again, for millions. For millions. And he's doing it at a time, and he knows this, keeps him up at night. He's doing it at a time when the old order, political, social, and economic, is globally collapsing. So where do you look? Where do you look for direction? Okay? Well, I think in a very important way it's Francis. And by talking about the Synod Church and by convoking the Synod and doing it in a different way, he's saying, in the end, it's not just about me. It's about us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Higgins. So I think we have about 10 minutes for formal questions, and then knowing what I know of Dr. Higgins, there will be time after also for informal questions. But I will walk around with the microphone for any questions we might have from the audience. So please raise your hands as questions come to you.
That's not walking around there, Dan.
What?
You said you were going to walk around.
I will.
You're sitting around.
I'm waiting for a question.
Yeah, there's a fine professor down there.
So thank you, Dr. Higgins. Given that you said Francis is more interested in action or, sort of progress than ideas, if I understand, how far forward do you think we have to look before we see action in terms of women, ordination of women, or a more sacramental role for women in the church?
I think, Marie, one of the things that's going to come out of the second session is that Francis is going to have to address the report of the second commission that he established to look at the authenticity of diaconal orders for women in the early church. As you know, he listened very carefully to the requests that were coming from various women's groups, including from the General Superior of Women in Rome, and established a commission of patrologists and historians and theologians and others to look at the practice of the early church. The commission was divided. There was not unanimity. That disturbed him. As a consequence, he did not act on the recommendations, but what he did do was to establish a second commission to produce another report distinguishing between diaconal orders between men and women. Is that a legitimate distinction to make? Or are they, in fact, the same order? And so that report must become close to conclusion, if not already. My sense is that at the second session, it will surface as an important issue, and he'll need to make a decision on it. And I think he will, because he will have gone through the synodal experience at this point, and so he'll have garnered or gauged the opinion of the representatives. But also, as you probably know, The various Episcopal conferences have been instructed by Rome, by the Secretariat of the Synod, to prepare a 4-page document. Rome is very clear. There's to be 4 pages. I don't know why 4, but anyway, 4 pages, and they have to have this submitted to Rome by, I think, May the 15th. So the Vatican is, and the Vatican has turned to places like Sacred Heart, universities, research institutes, think tanks, say, let's get this level of higher level reflection because the church needs it. The church is coming to the academy and asking for its help. Now, this has not been the tradition. The church has usually had a very tense relationship with the academy, and now it's looking to the academy to help it for the future. So this is an important development. I don't think, because he knows he doesn't enjoy any level of unanimity or consensus on this one, Marie, that he'll move on the ordination of women to the priesthood, to the presbyterate. I think in part because he's very concerned about how we're training the current presbyters. He has made some, if you want to do a thorough textual check of Pope Francis's berating of various rectors of major and minor seminaries in Italy and elsewhere, you can go online to do it. I mean, he's very clear about this, that we have to deal with the perduring problem of clericalism. So in Francis's mind, it's tiered. The ordination of women to the diaconate, the presbyterate, is just part of a larger discussion that must occur in terms of how the church will receive the teaching, the shift in the teaching, or the shift in the discipline. He also has the experience of the Anglican Church. I was very struck recently by an issue. I got approached by the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada to sit on their board for the Anglican Journal. And I thought, well, I should do this. It's a good ecumenical thing to do. So I sit on the board and whatnot, and I get to see various things that are before they were published. And one of them was a reflection by the principal of an Anglican, that's Episcopal in U.S. parlance, an Anglican College of Emmanuel and St. Chad at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, Ian Clark. And he said, we really need to listen to Pope Francis. He said, we have blessings of same-sex marriages, but we also have same-sex marriages themselves. We are wrestling with issues around their canonical and theological validity and what we should do and this and whatnot. And he says Francis has kind of gone right up the middle on this one. And he said, okay, well, we're not at the point yet where we could say anthropologically and theologically this is what we need to do. But we're at the point where spiritually and pastorally we can say that a blessing is a legitimate response to a request from two individuals without recognizing in any way the validity of that union, but recognizing the integrity of the requesters. And so that the blessing is a conduit of grace, and it's very different from any kind of interdiction or saying, no, you can't do this. It's complicated, it's fraught. We've already seen the response to Pope Francis's the document that came through the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, and every move the Pope makes to affect some change will create a counter reaction. And that's why he moves with caution. But also, again, he said, I was talking to Tom Rees. Some of you may know him. He's a Jesuit. He was a political scientist. He wrote one of the finest books, published, I think, by Harvard University Press, on the governance of the Catholic Church, its embassies, its nuncios, and whatnot. And you may remember, some of you, that he was the editor of America magazine in New York, and he was fired by Cardinal Ratzinger. And so he was in Rome covering the Synod, and he said, he said to me, Michael, have you noticed something very different about the composition of the Synod? And I said, yes, of course, clerical, non-clerical, young, old. I said, no. He says, I'm talking regionality. We're becoming increasingly an African and Asian church. In the heart of European Christianity, and he says, just look around the room. Okay, so that means we have to be really attentive to what are their specific cultural and other things. And that's what Francis is trying to do, right? Is it complicated? Yes. Is it imperfect? Certainly. But it is Francis taking the challenge of synodality himself. That's a long-winded response to your question, but I'm long-winded. It's my charism.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay.
Michael, first, thank you for a marvelous, marvelous presentation. Just fabulous. So, my concern is about the youth, particularly Catholic youth, but they're so disaffiliated and disengaged from the church, and even more now, I think, from the idea of God. And so what do you think Francis is thinking about that? You only had one representative at the synod who was a college student, maybe?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a church tomorrow, it's going to be with the youth of today, right?
Before this, very good question, Michelle, and I think it's something that occupies not only Francis, but indeed many in the episcopate. But there are marvelous illustrations of how Francis has been able to really tap into the genius of youth. Before we had the synod, we had Lisbon. And the experience in Lisbon was unlike any other. There were well over 1 million youth who were there. And they weren't engaged in pious piffle. They were serious kids. And they would have come from various communities like San Egidio, but they would have also come from their parishes and whatnot. And what drew them was not, okay, we're going to have a night of, sacred revelry and all, hootenanny or something like that. No, what drew them was the personality of Francis. It was the personality of Francis. And Francis is very attentive to the young. Surprisingly, you can see it even in papal audiences. He's drawn to the young. And I think part of it is his realization that we have failed the young. Our structures of governance in the church and outside the church, the deplorable state of the planet, the endless wars that never seem to cease, the breakdown in language civility, the corrosive hegemony of social media, where we have instant communication, but we have no communion. And so what Francis sees is a frayed society, a frayed planet. And he also sees, as you have said, the young as the harbingers of hope. It's one of the reasons why, when many couples are making decisions, it's understandable in a rational way, not to have children. They say, well, we don't want to have children because the planet's going to hell in a handbasket. We can't afford to have children because we don't make the income that the boomer generation did. We all know the arguments, right? Francis argues against that. And he doesn't argue against it on the grounds of humani vitae, that it's your job following the injunction in Genesis to get out and procreate. No, he's not. He's not doing that. He understands that the young and the progenerativity of the young is a statement of hope. This is hope. This is hope for the planet. It's hope for reform. It's hope for humanity. So from Francis's point of view, we despair of humanity is the paramount sin. That's why at the synod, when the bishops get dour or downcast or despairing or whatnot, he had nothing to do with that, right? Now, he's not a bubbly optimist. He's not holding meetings saying everything is great. But what he's saying is that the Christian has to be sustained by a creative and generative hope. And if all your hope is in structures that are in decay or decomposition, and you don't think spiritually about reform and replenishing and new ways of doing things, and the young can give you models of new ways of doing things, then we become a static and dead church. We'll become a static and dead society. Big thing, and I'll end on this, big thing about Francis And he wanted to make sure that the Synod fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters who were all there in that aula, that this isn't just about us. He would say again and again, outside this wall are the poor. Outside this wall are the immigrants. Outside this wall is the hatred of a vitriolic rhetoric that doesn't allow people to be respected. We have to keep that foremost in our mind. And he would bring them back. He'd bring them back. And he'd say, okay, we're talking about spirituality. We've got Father Ratcliffe there doing some marvelous stuff, situating us within contemporary Catholic challenges. But we got to remember that the gospel, if the gospel is not an agency of service, if it's just a theory, then we are wasting our time. So, and again, the fact that Francis allows all these homeless people to use the porticos, the gaps between the great pillars, Bernini pillars, because, that never happened when I've been in Rome before. There have been homeless people in Rome for a long time. It's because he's saying, if you lead by example. Peter kisses the feet of the adversaries. Peter washes the feet of lesbian Muslim prisoners. Now, it doesn't get more rarefied than that. That's what he did on Holy Thursday during the Mandatum. Shook up the Catholic world. Bishops saying, oh my God, not only is he washing the feet of, lesbians and Muslims, but they're women. Okay, well, how did this happen? Our Lord had only men at the table, okay? And so Francis does this because he moves the gospel hermeneutic to a greater place in the context of lived reality. This sounds so theoretical in a way, so programmatic and easy to say, but he's present in a way that popes haven't been for quite some time. And I think it's one of the reasons that he's created such resistance from Catholics. He's beloved all over the world. I've just finished a book, excuse this moment of shameless self-marketing here, but I finished a book called The Jesuit Disruptor, a personal portrait of Pope Francis that's going to be published in September of this coming year. And one of the people who came to me, out of the blue, I didn't know him, he came to me and he said, I want to provide you with research money. So I was telling Mike Iannazzi this. He's a rabbi. He says, I love Francis. And he says, I want to help. I said, no, there's a major publishing firm. They'll provide the appropriate funding. They don't, of course. But that's what I said. He said, but I know, I publish myself, I know you'll need help. I'll underwrite the index. So for thousands of dollars, he underwrote the index and he did other kinds of things. Why? Because he loves this Pope. Why? Because he's telegenic, because he's partial to Jews. One of his closest friends, of course, is Rabbi Skorka, who is a friend of Sacred Heart University, been here on several occasions. Yeah, in part, but mostly because he's a humanitarian and because he believes in his authenticity. I have not come across any critique from any secular source, and my book will be published by a major Canadian secular press, not Catholic press. They commissioned it, say whether there is a huge interest in your Pope because we think of him as our Pope. Now, I don't recall anything even remotely comparable, with the possible exception of John the 23rd, and even that would have been limited in time and space. Okay, so Francis's outside billing is great. Inside the church, he has lots of resistance. And that's something I think Catholics need to think seriously about.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Higgins for his insights.
Thanks, Dan. How many's going to classes?